In the frozen silence of winter, when rivers turn to stone and the earth hides its lifeblood beneath ice, the ancient Native American tribes still knew exactly where to find water. They read the snow like a map, followed the whispers of the wind, and trusted signs modern eyes no longer see. But how did they uncover drinking water in a world locked in frost? The winter steppes of North America were deadly with their silence and deceptive beauty, hiding a mortal threat to anyone who ventured there. The endless expanses of the Great Plains, covered with a meter-thick layer of snow, seemed to be the richest source of water on the planet. However, for the indigenous inhabitants of these places, the snowy desert was not a reservoir of moisture, but a treacherous trap. Travelers and explorers often did not understand why local tribes never rushed to eat snow, even when they were very thirsty. Watch till the end as we uncover the ingenious methods that transformed an icy wasteland into a source of life, and discover why everything you thought you knew about snow and survival could be dangerously wrong. Don't forget to subscribe to Ancient Horizons and hit that like button. And please tell us where you're watching from in the comments. The deadly deception of snow. The history of survival in these parts is written not in ink, but in the experience of generations who learned to extract life from icy death. Water here was valued more than gold, because in winter it became as hard as stone and as inaccessible as the stars. The northern winds turned rivers into impenetrable fortresses encased in armor of ice as thick as a man's height. To the average person, it seems that in winter, the problem of thirst disappears by itself. Water literally lies underfoot. But the reality was much harsher and required incredible ingenuity and knowledge of physics from the Indians. A mistake in obtaining water could cost the lives of an entire tribe stuck in a winter camp in the middle of a snowstorm. Every drop obtained in minus 30-degree frost required enormous energy and time. What if I told you that everything you believed about eating snow is untrue and could lead to death? Snow on the Great Plains looks like a clean and safe source of moisture, accessible to every traveler. But indigenous peoples such as the Lakota or Cheyenne learned from an early age the strict rule: never eat snow in its natural form. The problem was not the cleanliness of the precipitation, but the laws of thermodynamics that applied to the human body. Direct consumption of cold snow led to a sharp drop in body temperature, which was fatal in harsh winter conditions. The body expended a tremendous amount of calories to melt the ice crystals inside the stomach. Instead of quenching their thirst, people experienced rapid hypothermia and a loss of precious energy. The feeling of satiety from water was deceptive, as the volume of melted water was negligible compared to the volume of snow eaten. The mucous membranes of the mouth and throat were thermally burned by the cold, causing inflammation and making it impossible to eat normally. Constant snow eating led to cracking of the lips and tongue, which began to bleed and hurt. In the absence of medication, any minor wound in the mouth could become a gateway for serious infection. The Indians knew that snow consists mainly of air, and that to get a glass of water, you had to eat a whole mountain of ice chips. This process tricked the brain, creating the illusion of quenching thirst, while the body's dehydration only intensified. The chemical composition of snow also differed from usual drinking water in that it completely lacked minerals and salts. Consuming such distilled moisture washed away the last reserves of electrolytes necessary for the heart to function. A person became weak, their muscles cramped, and their consciousness began to cloud over due to the disruption of the water-salt balance. Wise leaders and experienced warriors strictly ensured that no one in the group succumbed to the temptation to scoop up a handful of snow on the go. There were special breathing techniques that allowed them to retain moisture in their mouths and endure thirst until they reached a rest stop. Only in exceptional cases, when there was no other option, was it permitted to melt small portions of snow in the mouth. But even then, an experienced survivalist tried not to swallow the cold mass immediately, but to warm it to body temperature. This required tremendous self-discipline when every cell in the body was screaming for water. It would be very interesting to hear your opinion. Could you resist the temptation to eat snow when you are very thirsty? Write about it in the comments, and don't forget to tell us where you're watching from. The ancient art of stone boiling. Want to know a secret that will change your perception of ancient cooking? When the Plains Indians did not have metal pots, they used a unique method of stone boiling. This method allowed them to melt snow and boil water in a container that could not be placed over an open fire. A specially treated bison stomach or a tightly woven basket was often used as a vessel. The leather bag was hung on 4 poles near the fire and filled with snow or ice. The container itself never touched the flames, so as not to burn through and spoil its precious contents. The main tools in this process were round stones, carefully selected from riverbanks. The stones were heated in the heart of the fire until they glowed red and began to radiate heat. The choice of stones was critical, as not every type of rock was suitable for such extreme heating. Layered or damp stones could explode when they hit the water, scattering dangerous fragments. Only hard rocks such as granite or basalt, capable of withstanding temperature changes, were used. The red-hot stone was carefully picked up with tongs made of branches and cleaned of ash and soot. After that, it was carefully lowered into a leather bag with snow or water. The snow instantly began to hiss, turning into steam and water, giving off cold to the hot stone. The cooled cobblestone was removed and replaced with a new one, just taken out of the fire. This cycle was repeated many times until the entire container was filled with hot water. Knowing which stones to choose and how to handle them was part of the mandatory training for young people. Nature provided everything necessary. One only needed to know how to use it properly. This simple but ingenious method allowed people to survive where it seemed impossible. Hidden sources: moss, sap, and living wells. Did you know that water can be boiled in a wooden box? What you have never seen is hidden under a thick layer of snow in wooded areas. When there were no open sources of water and nothing to melt the snow with, plants came to the rescue. The Indians knew that some types of moss, especially sphagnum, can retain a huge amount of moisture even in winter. This moss acted as a natural sponge, absorbing and retaining water in its structure, preventing it from freezing completely. Only those who knew the botany of their region perfectly could find such reserves under the snowdrifts. Extracting water from moss required physical effort and knowledge of the right places to look. It was necessary to dig up the snow at the roots of trees or in low-lying areas where moisture accumulated before the frost. The layers of moss found were collected into large clumps, which were heavy from the absorbed liquid. Then this moss was squeezed into vessels or directly into the mouth, yielding cloudy but drinkable water. The taste of such water was earthy and tart, but it saved people from dehydration. In addition, sphagnum had antiseptic properties, which made such water relatively safe. The phenolic compounds in the plant killed some of the bacteria, preventing intestinal infections. This was especially important in conditions where boiling was impossible due to the lack of fire. The Indians also used moss as a filter, passing meltwater through it to clean it of debris. The layer of moss trapped pine needles, sand, and small insects, making the water clear. In the birch and maple forests of the Northeast, there was another source of moisture: tree sap. At the end of winter, when the first thaws began, the trees woke up and began to push sap up their trunks. By making a neat cut in the bark and inserting a splinter, it was possible to collect the dripping liquid. This sap was not just water, but an energy drink rich in sugar and trace elements. Juice collection was a seasonal activity, but it coincided with the most difficult time of the year, when supplies were running low. People waited for this moment like a holiday, heralding the imminent arrival of spring. The sap was drunk fresh or boiled down to a syrup that could be stored for a long time. This source of moisture did not require fuel to extract, which was a huge advantage. Trees became living wells, providing clean and healthy liquid. However, there were dangers here too. It was necessary to know exactly which trees were safe. The sap of some species could be bitter or even poisonous to humans. Knowledge was passed down from elders who taught how to distinguish trees by their bark, even without leaves. Choosing the wrong tree could cost the entire tribe its health. Therefore, only experienced members of the community who knew the forest were entrusted with collecting sap. The ability to find water without open sources made them independent of rivers and lakes. This allowed hunting parties to go far into the territory without being tied to known water sources. If you're finding this fascinating, don't forget to hit that like button and share this video with friends who love history and survival skills. Breaking through the ice fortress. What if I showed you a time machine that could transport us to the frozen Missouri River in the 18th century? In winter, the rivers of the Great Plains turned into powerful ice roads that could be traveled, but getting to the water became a daunting task. The ice on these rivers could be a meter thick or more, creating an insurmountable barrier. To get to the water, Native Americans used special tools made of stone and bone. Heavy stone hammers on long handles were used to deliver the first crushing blows to the ice armor. The process of cutting a hole was hard physical labor that took several hours. The ice was as hard as granite, and each blow reverberated through the workers' hands. Chisels made from moose or deer antlers were also used, as they did not dull as quickly as stone. These tools were used to chip away pieces of ice, gradually digging deeper down toward the black water. They usually worked in pairs. One chopped while the other shoveled away the ice chips so they wouldn't get in the way. They tried to make the hole narrow at the bottom, but wide at the top, in the shape of a funnel. This made it easier to scoop out water and prevented the hole from freezing over quickly. As soon as the tool broke through the last layer, water rushed upward under pressure, filling the hole. This first water was often mixed with ice chips, but it was the most desirable reward for their labor. The holes were carefully guarded and regularly cleared of fresh ice. To keep the hole in working condition overnight, it was covered with skins, branches, and snow. This created an air cushion that slowed the freezing of the water. In the morning, it was enough to break the thin crust of ice to regain access to the water. If the hole was left open, the frost would freeze it over so much during the night that the work would have to be started all over again. The location for the hole was chosen wisely, avoiding areas with fast currents where the ice could be thin and dangerous. There was always a danger of falling through the ice, so work on the river was approached with caution. The Indians tested the strength of the ice with spear thrusts before stepping on it with their full weight. They often used long poles which they held across the ice so that, if they fell through, they could hold on to the edges of the hole. The water in the river was freezing, and falling into it meant almost instant death from shock and hypothermia. Rescuing a drowning person was a difficult operation that required quick and coordinated action from companions. In winter, the water level in the rivers dropped and air pockets formed under the ice. The Indians knew this and were able to find places where the ice sagged under its own weight. In such places, it was easier to break through to the water, and sometimes the ice cracked on its own, releasing water to the surface. These natural holes were a gift from heaven, but they had to be approached with even greater caution. Wild animals also used these places, which created the risk of an unwanted encounter. Where there were no large rivers, they looked for streams that might flow under deep snowdrifts. They determined the location of the stream by the sound of gurgling under the snow. What tool do you think was the most effective for cutting ice before the advent of iron? Share your thoughts in the comments. Sacred springs and underground treasures. The search for water in the winter steppes was not limited to snow and rivers. There were underground sources. The Indians of the Great Plains and the foothills of the Rocky Mountains knew the geography of springs that did not freeze even in the most severe frosts. These places were sacred and were passed down in oral maps from one generation to the next. Warm water gushing from the ground created an oasis around it where the snow melted and the grass turned green. The steam rising from such springs was visible from afar in the frosty air, serving as a beacon for travelers. Animals were also excellent guides in the search for hidden water. Traces of bison or deer converging at a single point in the middle of a snow-covered plain often indicated a spring that did not freeze. The Indians closely observed the behavior of birds circling above certain places in the desert. The presence of certain types of plants, such as willow or reeds sticking out from under the snow, indicated the proximity of groundwater. In such places, it was possible to dig a shallow well and reach the water that seeped through the soil. In areas with geothermal activity, such as modern-day Yellowstone, hot springs were common. The water in them could be too hot or saturated with sulfur, so it had to be cooled and settled. The use of such water required caution, as some sources could contain harmful substances. Tribal healers determined the suitability of water by its smell, color, and taste, protecting people from poisoning. Underground springs were often hidden in deep ravines and canyons, protected from the wind. Snow fell there in thick blankets, insulating the ground from freezing and allowing water to flow. To reach such a spring, one had to descend steep slopes, risking a fall. But the water from the spring was clean, cold, and delicious, which justified any risk. Thus, the map of water sources was the most important map in the mind of every Indian. It ensured safe travel and gave confidence in the future. The earth took care of its children if they knew how to listen to its quiet voice. The genius of ice transport. Are you ready for the shocking truth about transporting water? The most effective way to carry water supplies in winter was not to carry water at all. Liquid water is heavy. It sloshes around, shifts the carrier's center of gravity, and most importantly, it inevitably freezes in the cold, bursting the vessels. Therefore, Native Americans often harvested and transported water in a solid state, in the form of pieces of pure ice. This solves several logistical problems faced by nomadic peoples at once. Large blocks of transparent ice, free of air bubbles and impurities, were cut out of rivers or lakes. These blocks were easy to store, transport on sleds, or simply carry in your hands wrapped in animal skins. The ice did not spill, did not spoil clothes, and could be stored at the entrance to the dwelling for an unlimited time. When necessary, the required amount was simply chipped off a large piece and thrown into the cauldron. It was the ideal form of canned water, created by nature itself. Transporting ice allowed them to create water reserves directly in the camp, eliminating the need for daily trips to the river. This was especially important during blizzards when leaving the teepee was life-threatening. The mountain of ice blocks at the entrance ensured that the family would not be left without drinking water, even in the most severe weather. Ice melted more slowly than snow, but provided much more water per unit of volume, making it a more economical fuel. If the water had to be carried in liquid form, specially prepared vessels were used. Most often these were wineskins made from the whole skins of small animals or carefully sewn bison stomachs. The main task was to prevent the water from turning into ice during the journey. To do this, the containers were carried under outer clothing, closer to the body, using human warmth as a heater. Using ice as the primary method of storing water in winter was an ingenious adaptive solution. It turned the main disadvantage of winter, the cold, into an advantage for storage. This eliminated the problem of container tightness and the risk of their destruction. Why do you think modern tourists rarely think of carrying ice instead of water? Let us know in the comments. The key to liquid water. It is impossible to melt snow or ice without a heat source. But what if there are no trees around? The Great Plains were often treeless areas where wood was found only in the floodplains of rare rivers. In winter, when everything was covered with snow, finding fuel became even more difficult than finding water. The Indians found a solution by using what was always abundant where the bison herds grazed. The main fuel of the plains was dried bison dung, known as bison chips. These flat cakes, dried by the sun and wind, were collected during the warm season and stored for future use. In winter, they were dug out from under the snow, with the location of the deposits determined by the terrain. Bison dung burned with a hot, even flame, producing almost no smoke, but giving off enough heat to boil water. The smell of the smoke was distinctive, but for the inhabitants of the plains it meant warmth, food, and life. Gathering fuel was a constant duty for women and children, who would walk far from the camp with bags on their backs. In deep snow, it was exhausting work that required endurance. If there was no bison dung, they used dry grass twisted into tight bundles. The grass burned instantly, so a huge amount was needed to keep the fire under the cauldron going. Even animal bones, which contained fat and could burn at high temperatures, were used. A bonfire made of bones gave off intense heat, but it was not easy to light. It required good kindling. Fuel economy was paramount. Small fires were built deep in the ground so that the wind would not carry away the heat. The fire was surrounded by stones, which accumulated energy and continued to heat the water even after the fuel had burned out. The Indians used special methods of laying the fire to direct all the heat strictly upwards, towards the vessel with water. The teepee, a traditional dwelling, was designed to retain as much heat from the hearth as possible inside. The smoke escaped through a valve at the top, while the heat remained below, warming the inhabitants and melting the snow. Inside the dwelling, there was always a container of snow next to the fire, slowly turning into water. As a result, water and fire were inextricably linked in the winter life of the Indians. Without one, it was impossible to obtain the other. This dependence dictated the rhythm of life for the entire tribe. Strategic camp placement. The choice of a place for winter camp was not a random decision, but a complex strategic calculation. The right choice determined whether the tribe would have water and shelter for the coming months. The ideal location had to combine proximity to water, the availability of fuel, and natural protection from the wind. Such places were usually found in deep river valleys, sheltered by high banks or cliffs. The location of the camp in a lowland area allowed it to be closer to the groundwater level and river ice. The trees growing along the riverbed provided fuel and served as an additional barrier against blizzards. However, being too close to the water carried the risk of spring flooding or dampness. Therefore, the teepees were set up on elevated terraces, striking a balance between resource availability and safety. In the forests of the Northeast, the Iroquois built their longhouses near streams that did not freeze. The settlement was planned so that the paths to the water were as short and convenient as possible. In winter, these paths were constantly cleared and compacted, turning them into ice gutters. This made it easier to transport heavy containers and sleds with water. They tried not to trample the snow around the camp unnecessarily, keeping it clean for domestic needs. There was a clear zoning system. Places for dumping garbage and waste were located far away. This sanitary rule was strictly observed so as not to pollute the snow, which might be needed for fuel. Clean snow was a backup source of water that was always at hand. For subarctic peoples such as the Cree, deep snow was both a home and a source of water. They built temporary shelters by burrowing into snowdrifts and used the heat of the earth. Inside such a shelter, the snow on the walls melted and could be collected. But the main thing was the ability to find places where water flowed under the snow. The migration of bison also influenced the choice of campsite, as hunting provided food and skins. But bison also needed water, so their trails often led to hidden springs. The Indians followed the herds, knowing that the animals would lead them to life. Symbiosis with nature allowed them to use the instincts of animals for their own survival. When the resources around the camp were depleted, the tribe would set out on a journey. It was a difficult ordeal, but necessary for survival. Mobility was their main defense against hunger and thirst. Condensation, capturing invisible water. Inside dwellings, whether teepees or wigwams, the air was always saturated with moisture from people's breath and steam from the fire. In winter, when the outer walls of the dwelling were icy, frost or condensation formed on the inside of the skins. The Indians learned to use even this insignificant source of moisture to their advantage. In the morning, the frost was carefully scraped into vessels, yielding a small amount of clean water. In the longhouses of the Iroquois, where many families lived, humidity was high and condensation was a serious problem. Water dripping from the ceiling could spoil food supplies and furs, so collecting it was a necessity. Hanging special gutters made of bark allowed this moisture to be drained and collected. It was an internal water supply system that worked on the difference in temperature. There was also a method of collecting dew or frost from plants, although it was less effective in winter. Early in the morning before sunrise, frost was shaken off bushes and tall grass onto spread-out skins. This icy sand was then poured into boilers for melting. The method was laborious, but it allowed water to be obtained without digging up the frozen ground. The use of steam during cooking was also a way to save water. Lids on pots, albeit primitive, prevented precious moisture from evaporating into the air. Drops that settled on the lid dripped back into the pot, preserving the volume of liquid. In conditions of water scarcity, every drop of steam counted. In sweat lodges, which were used for ritual purification, steam was produced by splashing water on hot stones. This procedure, which might seem wasteful, was actually important for health. It allowed for deep cleansing of the pores and warming of the body, replacing washing with large amounts of water. After the sweat lodge, the Indians wiped themselves with snow, which was an effective and economical way to maintain hygiene. Condensation was also collected while breathing, using thick scarves or fur masks. The moisture exhaled by a person settled on the villi and froze. The ice could be shaken off the scarf and melted, returning some of the water lost by the body. This principle of moisture recycling was intuitively used during long journeys. Thus, even the air around them became a source of water if they knew how to obtain it. The physics of condensation was mastered by Native Americans in practice, long before textbooks were written. The economics of survival. Obtaining water in winter was not just a daily task, but a constant struggle for survival. Energy balance was the main law of life. You cannot spend more calories on obtaining water than it provides in benefits. Every trip for snow, every piece of ice cut, every piece of fuel collected had its price in units of human strength. Chiefs and elders strictly ensured that this price did not become too high. The Indians were masters at conserving their own bodily resources so that they would not need to drink as much. Smooth movements, no unnecessary fuss, the ability to breathe through the nose, all this reduced moisture loss. Work was done at a steady pace, without jerks, so as not to cause sweating. Sweat in the cold was dangerous. It cooled the body and dehydrated it faster than hard work. Water was distributed among the tribe according to a strict hierarchy of needs. Children, the elderly, and the sick, whose bodies were weaker, drank first. Warriors and hunters, who had greater endurance, received their share last. This rule ensured the survival of the most vulnerable members of the community and the preservation of the future generation. The culture of water consumption was shaped by centuries of scarcity. No one drank water in one gulp. They sipped it through their teeth, savoring every sip. This allowed them to better saturate their bodies and quench their thirst with less volume. Water was often drunk warm, so as not to waste the body's energy on heating it. If there was not enough water, the Indians used chewing stimulants, pieces of bark, resin, or smooth pebbles. This stimulated salivation and tricked the brain, reducing the painful feeling of a dry throat. This technique allowed them to hold out until they reached a resting place or found a source of water. Psychological resilience was no less important than physical access to water. We look at snow-covered plains as a beautiful landscape, but for them, it was a challenge, and they accepted this challenge with dignity, century after century. We have immersed ourselves in a harsh world where a simple cup of water cost hours of hard work and risk. The Native Americans of North America proved that human intelligence and observation can find a way out of the most hopeless situations. From boiling stones to collecting condensation, their methods were the height of rationality and ingenuity in Stone Age conditions. They learned to see water where it was hidden from view, in stone, ice, wood, and even the air. These ancient survival skills make us take a fresh look at the comforts we take for granted. The lesson that the history of indigenous peoples teaches us is simple. Knowledge of nature is the key to life. If you enjoyed discovering these incredible survival techniques, please subscribe to Ancient Horizons, hit that like button, and share this video with anyone who loves history and adventure. Write in the comments what other aspects of Native American life you would like to see in future videos. And don't forget to tell us where you're watching from. Your support helps us continue exploring the amazing history of human survival. Until next time, stay curious.